Hi, third graders. Welcome back. We started reading yesterday The Case of the Gasping Garbage. And if you remember, we're really learning a lot about how readers can understand and explain the characters' motivations and actions in a story. And I want you to be thinking back to the chapter we read yesterday. And if you remember, I told you that this book is full of several short stories, and they all take place in 2 chapters. So we get the complete story over 2 chapters. And thinking back to chapter 1 yesterday, I wonder if you can answer that question. Remember, one of the characters was Gabby, and she called Drake on the telephone, and she called him instead of Frisco, the other kind of scientist in town or in their 5th grade class. Can you remember why? Why do you think she would call Drake instead of calling Frisco first? Think about what you've learned about Drake as a character and as Nell as a character. Think about what they're like, and maybe who would you call? Remember what we learned a little bit about Drake? We said he's a pretty dedicated person. That was how we described him on the inside. He's very excited to work on science. He got really excited when Gabby called. What motivates him? He wants to get the right answer. He likes to follow the rules and do good science so he knows the facts, right? We learned Frisco is not like that. He kind of fudges the answers. He's not real thorough. Drake and Nell are quite the opposite. So thinking about what we've learned about Drake, right, it kind of tells us that he's really determined to use good science and to solve mysteries, right? He wants to do the right thing and get the right answers. So that's why Gabby would have called Drake first. She knows he's reliable. He does the work and he tries his best, where Frisco, not so much. Okay, today we're going to think about this. As we read this chapter, and you should have already read it to yourself, so this would be called a close read. We read it a second time. How do Nell and Drake conduct their investigations? So how do they go about doing the work? I want you to be thinking about that as we read chapter 2. We're going to kind of do a little bit of a retell at the end of this, thinking about why do they make the decisions and the choices that they do. Okay, sorry about that little extra piece there. My camera's right where it is. Chapter 2 is called Great Gasping Garbage. Follow along. Drake and Nell slogged through mud puddles, lugging the garbage can between them. For a monster, it wasn't very heavy. Even so, Drake slipped and almost fell because his glasses had fogged. Nell helped him up and brushed him off. She was a great partner. And besides, she was his best friend. So we just learned that Nell was a great partner. Think about how you choose your friends. Finally, they pushed the garbage can through Drake's back door, dragged it up 2 flights of stairs and into the attic lab. They set the garbage can in a corner next to a heater. We must simulate the same environment, said Drake. 87 degrees to be precise, said Nell. Drake cleaned his glasses and put on his white lab coat. Nell did too, except she didn't have any glasses to clean. They stuck sharpened pencils behind their ears, sat on stools, and opened their lab notebooks. Drake pulled a book off the shelf and shuffled through it until he found the right page. It read, Monster Analysis, What to Do When Your Garbage is Gasping. Now, it sounds to me like they're prepared with their materials. They've got their pencil, their notebook, they're sitting down, they're focused. Think about how that makes them a good scientist. Just then, Drake's mom poked her head in the lab. Kate Doyle was a fine cook and ran her own catering company from home. Blueberry muffins were her specialty. Now Mrs. Doyle asked if they wanted any hot chocolate with their muffins, seeing that it was such a damp, drizzly day. No thanks, Drake said politely. Just muffins. Coffee, decaf, black, said Nell, and she shoved a pencil behind her ear. Nell forgot she had already had a pencil behind her other ear. Affirmative, Drake's mom said, and closed the door. Real scientists don't drink hot chocolate. Ditto for real detectives, and Drake and Nell were both. Let's go over the facts again, said Nell. Well, she's interested in the facts. Facts are truth, right? We can prove that. Drake nodded. Just the facts, ma'am. Together they pored over their observations. After a while, Drake's dad stuck his head in the lab. Sam Doyle owned a science, equipment, and supply company. He regularly brought home used equipment for the lab: computers, microscopes, telescopes, glassware, Bunsen burners, even an old sink that he had plumbed with hot and cold water. If either Drake or Nell needed equipment, Mr. Doyle was the man. Check out that picture. You can see they are serious scientists, right? They've got all of the tools that a scientist would use. Here's a picture of the garbage, and you can tell it's gasping. It says gulp, gulp, gulp everywhere. Here are their lab books. Okay, it looks like they're down to some serious business. Now, Mr. Doyle glanced at the rumbling garbage can and told them to be careful. We will, said Drake and Nell. Mr. Doyle rolled his eyes and closed the door. What do you think we're going to do? Asked Drake. Blow up the lab? You did last time, reminded Nell. That's beside the point. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. Based on our observations, scientist Nell, I have formulated a hypothesis. And you know from science that a hypothesis is an educated guess, right? He's kind of making a prediction based on all the facts and information that he has. He might be right, he might be wrong. All through the evening they worked. Later, Mrs. Doyle brought them tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches with a pickle on the side. Mrs. Doyle always cooked from her vegetarian menu whenever Nell was around because Nell was a vegetarian. Drake and Nell washed their hands and sat at Drake's desk, knowing they should never eat or drink while conducting experiments. They were top-notch scientists. Are you catching on that they're really following the rules, right? They're really concerned about getting very accurate results. After supper, Nell called her mom and asked if she could stay extra late, given that there was no school tomorrow and that they were swamped with experiments and under a deadline. Ann Fossey, that's Nell's mom, was a biology professor at Mossy Lake University. Her specialty was wildlife, biology. Goodness gracious, sakes alive, exclaimed Professor Fossey. Sounds like you're a busy scientist. Now, don't you worry about a thing, my dear. I'll be sure to feed your rats and lizards. And don't forget about my snakes and bugs. Of course, dear, said Professor Fossey. I'll leave the light on for you. So if Nell is liking lizards and rats and snakes and bugs, it tells me she's really into animals and nature. Finally, after midnight, just when Nell was on her fourth cup of decaf, they had their answer. In the morning, Nell hurried back to Drake's house. They called Gabby first thing. Meet us in the lab, said Nell. We've discovered the identity of the monster. After Gabby arrived, Drake paced the floor while Nell sat on a stool. You see, Ms. Talberg, Drake was saying, it's really quite simple. Nell? Thank you, Detective Drake. First of all, said Nell, the garbage can sounded hollow when we tapped on it. Second, the garbage can wasn't too heavy. You see, Ms. Talberg, said Drake, most monsters are quite heavy. In addition, added Nell, the garbage can was stored in a very warm environment. So they're thinking, it's not very heavy, it's not full, and it was by something that was really warm. We copied, remember that word simulated? That means to copy. We copied that environment in our lab by setting the can next to the heater and checking its temperature. But most important, the garbage can smelled like bread. Remember, your dad is a baker, said Drake. The best baker around, to be exact. Therefore, based on the clues in our observations, I developed an educated guess, what we scientists call a hypothesis. I believed that the monster lurking inside your garbage can was not really a monster at all. But, yes? Asked Gabby, her eyes wide. Yeast, said Drake. Pure and simple yeast. Yeast? Yes, yeast. Allow scientist Nell to explain. Nell pointed to a chalkboard with her long wooden pointer. As I said, the smell of fresh-baked bread was our biggest clue. You see, yeast is used in making bread. Yeast is a living fungus that eats starches and sugars. They then turn the starches and sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. Here are their garbage can clues. Sounded hollow, wasn't heavy, warm environment, smelled like bread. Gabby's dad, a baker. The tiny bubbles in bread, said Drake, are the result of carbon dioxide gas. Nell tapped the chalkboard with her pointer. You see, Gabby, your dad must have thrown away a combination of yeast and flour, ingredients used in baking bread, easily purchased at any grocery store. Drake pushed up his glasses. With the right amount of moisture and a warm environment, added Nell, the yeast was able to grow and multiply by feeding on the flour inside the can, finished Drake. Quite harmless, really. But the yeast produced so much carbon dioxide gas that the garbage can simply had to burp to release some of the gas. We tested our hypothesis, said Nell, with a thorough set of experiments. We examined the yeast under the microscope and grew it in several different mediums. We've positively identified yeast as your culprit. You can be certain there is no monster inside the garbage can. Naturally, Gabby was a little disappointed. After all, yeast was not as exciting as a blood-sucking monster. She shook their hands anyway for a job well done. I knew you could do it, she said. I can't wait to tell all my friends. Nell handed Gabby their business card. Call us anytime. Later that day, Drake wrote in his lab notebook, monster analysis, a success. Hypothesis correct. Received 2 prize loaves of bread, extra raisins, extra nuts, as payment. Rating on the delicious scale, 10. Paid in full. So it sounds to me like Gabby thought they did an A-plus job. She said, I'm going to tell all my friends. Do you think if they had not done a good job, she would have shared good information with her friends? Maybe she had hired Frisco instead and he didn't do a good job. She's going to share that information, right? And tell people he didn't do a great job. Let's kind of think back, right? We're learning a little bit more about Drake and Nell as characters. We learned a little bit more about Nell today and their families who are supportive to them. Let's be thinking, okay? These characters are going to be in the entire book. We're going to start a new story with the same characters tomorrow. So if we look back at chapter 1, let's think. These were the characters in chapter 1. Here was the setting, right? They live in Mossy Lake. That's their town. We learned that. But more specifically, they were in Drake's attic lab, and they were also in Gabby's garage during this part of the story. These were the events, the things that happened in that chapter. Drake got a call, right, to solve a mystery, and then he and Nell met at Gabby's to investigate. So today, if we're thinking back, we learned a few more characters, their parents, right, Mr. and Mrs. Doyle, and then Nell's mom, Professor Fossey. Same setting, Mossy Lake, right? They were back in Drake's attic lab the entire time. They also invited Gabby over. And then the events, right? Drake and Nell use that research, that information to discover that the monster really isn't a monster. It's just the yeast in that garbage can. And then Gabby paid them off with bread. Okay, not a bad payment. So good readers are always thinking back about the characters and the setting, the events, what's happening in the story. And they're also thinking about the characters themselves. What makes them do the things that they do? Tomorrow, we're going to start chapter 3. And it's a little bit of a different story. And I think you're going to learn a little bit more about Nell in this particular chapter.